Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to THD's second virtual event series. Today we have The Changing Times, a conversation with Supervisor Aaron Peskin and Joe Eskenazi. My name is Nick Ferris. I am the treasurer for the Telegraph Hill Dwellers. We are a neighborhood organization that feels very fortunate to live in this special corner of the city, and we certainly do not take it for granted. If you feel similarly, we would love to speak with you. Please get involved, become a member. There are a ton of ways to get plugged in, even during coronavirus, as you can see here, and you can do so at thd.org. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I think everyone knows them very well. We are certainly very fortunate to have them both. Supervisor Peskin is our District 3 supervisor. He is serving his fourth non-consecutive term. Joe Eskenazi is the managing editor as well as columnist at Mission Local. Both Aaron and Joe are very impressive leaders in their own fields. They have incredible knowledge about the city. Yes, current events, local issues, politics, but also the history of this city and how and why things are the way they are. And having that perspective is critical when seriously discussing any topic. Now, one housekeeping item, we have allocated some time at the end for a few questions. So if you have any, please submit them via the Q&A chat at the side of the window. Also, I would like to wish a very happy birthday to Rachel Rodriguez, who is joining us today on her birthday. So on that note, I would like to welcome and pass things over to Supervisor Peskin and Joe.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
Us.
And somehow, and congratulations to Aaron for wasting no time for being able to log in 4 seconds before we went live. So Aaron wasted 3 seconds technically. Let me start by asking a fraught question that everybody asks these days that's very hard to answer, which is, how are you doing?
My hair is getting longer. Everybody's hair is getting longer. But come next week, after the Board of Supervisors actually unanimously passed a variance and attestation to the state of California, we are going to move up reopening of any number of things, but most importantly to me, socially appropriately distanced haircuts, and I'm getting mine on Wednesday.
Well, congratulations. Do they have like a scissor on a pole, or how do they work that?
I will let you know on Thursday. Yeah. But look, I mean, it's been an incredibly tough and stressful time for all of us, and I profoundly thank San Franciscans for their patience, for their tolerance. Everybody is very, very frustrated, but most especially for seeing a lot of the best in people. Today we actually had a little thank you Zoom meeting for Self-Help for the Elderly that stepped up their food delivery program from a few hundred a day to over 5,000 a day. At the beginning of the pandemic, as unemployment soared, making sure that people had the absolute basics, food, making sure that people were not being evicted who couldn't pay the rent. Those were the most important things at that time. I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, which none of us were ready for, none of us trained for. As a supervisor on and off for the last 20 years, I cannot tell you how many drills I have been to for an earthquake, but there was nothing in the rule book or the training that prepared us for a pandemic.
Well, I bet there will be now. What are the things that keep you up at night, Aaron, assuming that you are kept up at night? You know, I mean, what are the things that, you know, that when people come in, they're nervous, that you say, oh, well, that's not as big a deal. But what makes you nervous? What are the things within your control and out of your control that make you nervous here in San Francisco?
So during the pandemic, as one of 11 members of, if you will, the board of directors of a municipal corporation, the big things that keep me up at night are the fact that the people who were most vulnerable before the pandemic are the people who are hurting the most now. And some of them are being taken care of, whether they're children in low-income families who don't have access to summer camps, who haven't had access to school, many of them without computer technology to be able to participate in schools. That's been really rough, and trying to figure out ways, both at the micro level with individual constituents and at the macro level, has kept me awake at night. I've always been proud of, and we should all be proud of the fact that San Francisco, as a city, has always balanced its budget, has always had superlative bond ratings. But we're going to, over the next 2 years, we see a $2 billion downturn in the city's.
1.7.
I'm rounding 1.7 to 2, Joe, but there's no good news out there. And we're going to have to pick amongst our children in the budget process. And that keeps me awake at night.
We'll get to that, and that's going to be heavy. So we'll get to that in a bit. But, well, actually, why not get to that? People asked me in the run-up to this to ask you why the Board of Supervisors didn't make a legal case out of the whole hotel ordinance. And for those who are tuning in who are unfamiliar, the Board of Supervisors unanimously passed legislation mandating the city obtain 8,250 hotel rooms, and the mayor didn't do it. You and I had discussed this, but you know, what can you do and what can you not do with regard to that kind of situation? And how much is that still a sticking point between the board and the mayor?
It's still, let me take a step back. The good news is, I have to say, both within the board, the 11 supervisors, amongst ourselves who come from different factions, who have different personal relationships, who represent different parts of the city, I really have to say are getting along quite well. Many differences have been set aside because we all know that we have to be unified during this crisis. And the same thing has largely been true between the board and the mayor. Granted, it is a check and balance system, and the executive and legislative branches have roles to play. I have to say, the one profound sticking point during this entire crisis has been the issue that you just put your finger on, which is, as San Francisco was making a little bit of success in tent encampments, in the homeless crisis, and our behavioral health crisis in San Francisco, all of that was washed away in a matter of weeks by the pandemic, as the number of intents in San Francisco multiplied by a factor of 3, as people who were most vulnerable got pushed onto the street. And the board felt unanimously, actually almost unanimously, that the right thing to do was to commandeer hotels, all of which were vacant. The price point was low. We were being reimbursed by both the United States of America and the state of California with very little local money. But the mayor does have some legitimate points. Bringing the kind of staffing that was needed has been problematic. We are slowly actually getting there. We are actually now replacing city disaster service workers with nonprofit workers to staff those hotels. So those numbers are starting to creep up. Many members of the board have fought vociferously for that. I've managed to get a few people off of the streets in District 3 personally, but it continues to be a source of friction, probably the only real source of friction during the pandemic between the legislative and executive branches. And
explain to people, and maybe explain to me, how this works. Is the relationship between the mayor and members of the Board of Supervisors like the sheepdog and the coyote on Looney Tunes, where like morning Frank, morning Sam, and they check out and then they can be social, or is there real animosity there?
Well, I can speak on behalf of my personal relationship with our chief executive officer, London Breed. And I've known London for 20 years, and she and I personally actually, we like one another. That does not mean that I don't stand up and fight for what I believe in. But she came to North Beach yesterday to honor essential workers at Cole Hardware and the Nature Stop, where my wife and I shop all of the time. And she was delighted to be in the neighborhood. It was fun to joke with her But that doesn't mean that when it comes to rejecting bad commission appointments that I won't stand up and do it, that when it comes to fighting for more hotels for our unhoused population during the pandemic, that I'm not going to stand up and fight those fights. But we get along. I think that her relationship varies with different members of the board. But even members of the board that she personally doesn't get along with that well, they've been able to get stuff done. I mean, the advent of Healthy SF to address our behavioral health crisis came between her and a couple of individuals that are my colleagues that are probably her least favorite people on the board. But at the end of the day, everybody got in a room and worked it out. And that is coming to the ballot this November in the form of a robust bond to continue to address our behavioral health and supportive housing challenges in the city and county.
Those were entertaining images you posted of the walk around town. What exactly was the goal of that? Was it just to check on people? And also I was wondering what exact shade of blue was the mayor's outfit?
It was actually a little bit more to the chartreuse side. And if you saw that picture, I actually had a color wheel at Cole Hardware, and I picked out the exact color that was her suit. But it was actually, in all seriousness, one of those lovely moments where the highest ranking elected official in San Francisco was coming to the community to say words of thanks to people who have really put their lives on the line. Tina at Cole Hardware, Rick Karp at Cole Hardware, one of the early champions for our chain store controls in San Francisco, just to take a moment out and thank them for choosing to stay open for the last 100 days since we sheltered in place under an emergency order on March 16th. I mean, it was lovely to go to the Nepali folks, Nima Sherpa, who runs the Nature Stop, and just be able to say to him, thank you for staying open and continuing to serve people food. And actually, one of the happiest parts of this job is to take a few moments out and acknowledge how incredible the diverse people of the city and county are. And that's what we did yesterday. It was probably the highlight of my week.
Well, I hope that people appreciate it. And it was also good that there were no vans that pulled up from the feds that took in another city hall official, mayor office staff, such as Sandra Zuniga. Let me ask about that. You've been around for a long time. As Nick said in the introduction, you've been on and off for 20 years in government service. What do people understand and what do they not understand about the culture of corruption that is being exposed drips and drabs through the Mohammed Nuru probe? Because for those who weren't following yesterday, another announcement, the feds filed more charges against Walter Wong. And this one ties into District 3 because these charges stem from the Hilton in Chinatown. What do we not get? And what are things that you guys knew all along or theorized? And what is surprising you?
So let me roll it back 20 years, Joe, and to everybody who's listening. When I first ran for supervisor in the year 2000, Willie Brown was in his second term in office as the mayor of the city and county of San Francisco. He was elected to the state legislature. I kid you not, the year I was born in 1964. And there were profound and reasonable concerns that Willie Brown was hiring his friends, was steering contracts in the wrong direction. He never actually got tagged for that, either in Sacramento or in San Francisco. But it created two words that I try never to use, which is the city family. And that city family survived through 2 terms of Gavin Newsom, who I have to say to Mayor Newsom, now Governor Newsom's credit, he put the brakes on to a certain extent. That was back when I was president of the Board of Supervisors and actually created the Government Audit and Oversight Committee to look into allegations of wrongdoing. And it was exacerbated during the period when Ed Lee was made interim mayor in 2011 and continued through Ed Lee's tenure until his unfortunate passing 2 years ago. And many of the old players that happened, that became ascendant under Willie Brown, became reascendant under Ed Lee. And I really want to thank and acknowledge our city attorney, an independent elected official, Dennis Herrera, who has allowed this investigation to go wherever it goes. And the fact that the U.S. attorney continues to file charges is in large part because the city attorney and their investigators have turned over oodles of documents and information to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And I would have liked to think that this problem had gone away in San Francisco, but obviously it is still there, whether it's the culture of influence at the Department of Building Inspection that led to Tom Huey's untimely resignation, and really the shame and stain that has been brought to the city by one or two individuals in particular, Mohammed Nuru and Sanandra Zaninga.
Now, we've talked about this in our interviews. You initially helped raise funds for Mohammed the better part of 2 decades ago. Is this something that you have to look back and think it was a bad decision, or was it the best decision to make at the time?
No, I have to tell you, at the time, I thought it was the right decision. And when he got busted earlier this year, I said that I don't believe in second chances. I believe in redemption. I thought that he had the capacity to be redeemed. Remember, at that time, he was a relatively low-level city employee. He ultimately was charged with nothing in those days. And actually, the handful of dollars that we raised for him to get an attorney, he ultimately gave to charity. But no, I believe in supporting city staff. I believe in supporting my own staff. I believe in redemption. But this guy obviously was beyond redemption.
Should we be introspective as a city when stuff like this is going on, but also when if polled and if asked a blind question, who got arrested by the FBI yesterday, people would just say, oh, it must have been Mohammed Nuru. So I mean, he obviously had a reputation that preceded him. What kind of introspection are we due as a city based upon what we've learned through this incredible forensic exams of bank accounts and things like that, and bidding processes that the FBI has put out there for us, and what did we know all along?
So let me tell you about my own introspection and my own self-reflection about the government and government officials' relationship with the head of the Department of Public Works, Mohammed Nuru, which is that all of us want to please our constituents. And Mohammed Nuru understood that when a supervisor called and said that this pile of garbage needed to be cleaned in the next 10 minutes, or when you forwarded him one of the 300 emails that you get every day, and they had already called 311 and gotten no satisfaction, that rather than fixing the systemic problems in government, we knew Mohammed Nuru was the go-to guy and he would fix it. And actually, that is my fault. That is my colleagues' fault. That is several mayors' fault, which is that we overly empowered somebody rather than fixing what was systemically broken in the government. And I think that is the take-home lesson for all of us. There were also, and I didn't realize it at the time, because you expect that when a constituent wants something cleaned up, wants something fixed, that's exactly what the head of the Department of Public Works is supposed to do. But I didn't see all of the places where there was aberrant behavior. And let me give you an example. The best example is the bridge over Kearny Street that connects the Hilton Hotel to Portsmouth Square, which, as we have been going through a public process for the redesign of Portsmouth Square, which is going to be in the bond that goes before the voters in November.
Well, that's good.
Mohammed Nuru fought the removal of that bridge that planners supported, that the Rec and Park Department supported, and that the people who participated in a very robust public process from Chinatown and beyond supported. And I should have seen at that moment that there was something that was wrong. I didn't really understand it at the time. I had no idea that it was because of his connection to the owners of that Hilton property at 750 Kearny Street. I have since realized that he was carrying their water because they wanted to keep that bridge.
I don't think that's been reported out yet.
I think that was actually on KQED.
Oh, then good for them. They got that one. Let me ask you a deeper question about this. When I call people, when I look on the internet, the crisis we're at now and the fiscal crisis coming seems to have re-entrenched a lot of people with their ideas. This is what people say. I wish we'd done what I wanted to do so long ago. What ideas of yours have you grown more attached to, and what have you sought fit to question now that we do have a different atmosphere?
So, Joe, there are many things that San Francisco and its government have been very good at. I've mentioned a few of them. The fact that we continue to enjoy extremely healthy fiscal reserves, one of the best urban municipal bond ratings in America from Standard & Poor, from Fitch, you name it. But we clearly, and this is under many mayors, going all the way back to Dianne Feinstein through Art Agnos, have failed to deal with behavioral health on our streets, with the homeless crisis that is not only San Francisco's shame, but urban America's shame, as the federal government has abandoned the inner cities around the United States of America. And clearly that has been exacerbated during COVID-19. That remains and has increased as a top priority. But there are also things that I was very interested in prior to the pandemic that we should not lose sight of. Environmental goals, whether they are getting our multi-billion dollar pension fund to divest from fossil fuels, as climate change is the imperative of our time, as sea level rise is lapping up on all three sides of this peninsula that we call home, threatening the Bay Area, threatening our beaches up and down the state of California that I know in my incarnation as a member of the Coastal Commission, that I know in my incarnation as part of the Bay Conservation and Development Commission and the Bay Restoration Authority. We must not lose sight of those things during the pandemic. The same thing was something that I have taken many bites at over time, which is all of the plastics and microplastics that are in our environment and our garbage stream. We cannot lose sight of those things during the pandemic. And indeed, opportunists, including the plastic industry, have actually used COVID-19 to go back to their bad ways. Our desire that the mayor and the board shares to finally realize the opportunity for true municipal power, to get Pacific Gas and Electric, or not to sound high-handed, what I call them pigs, greed, and extortion, to sell their local distribution and transmission assets to the city and county by and through our Public Utilities Commission, which we believe we can afford, and we have actually made offers to PG&E. That's what we need to think about for the next century, and that's precisely what early city leaders thought about in 1928 when they bought out the Spring Valley Water Company and created our water utility that delivers the cleanest water at reasonable prices to the people of the city and county of San Francisco, a system that we have rebuilt from soup to nuts, made earthquake proof with a lot of redundancy through the system. Those are the things that continue to be our priorities.
Well, it would have been harder to buy in 1929. How do we afford these things now?
I'm sorry, say that again, Joe.
It would have been harder to buy in 1929. How do we afford these things now?
How do we afford them?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even started to talk about the budget, but buying. Let's look at PG&E's infrastructure, and you were very adamant and bullish about making that move the better part of a year ago. Is it something that's fiscally possible now?
It absolutely remains fiscally possible. We have actually hired some of the best experts and finance professionals in the United States of America as it relates to the acquisition of utility assets. And the answer is that because San Francisco does not have the profit motive, is not a utility that has stockholders, without that profit motive, we can charge the same or lesser rates and float revenue bonds for the acquisition of Pacific Gas and Electric's assets in the city and county of San Francisco. That remains true through the pandemic. It will remain true after the pandemic when we find a vaccine.
Let me also ask, and this is only tangentially related, one of the pieces of legislation that you'd pushed harder on the cusp of the pandemic was the vacancy tax, the storefront vacancy tax. How is that going to work now?
So, yes, the pandemic has thrown a temporary wrench into that. Clearly, part of what we were feeling in the overheated economy that lasted longer than anybody thought it would until COVID-19 ended up here and everywhere around the planet was the fact that not all, but many landlords had unrealistic expectations of value for small businesses. And one way to address that, it had been done, I wish it was a San Francisco first, but it was not. It had been done in other municipalities, was to levy a tax on property owners who kept their storefronts vacant because they were seeking unrealistic per square foot values. The voters embraced that by over 70%. Any funds raised, and remember, we didn't want to raise funds. We actually wanted to create an incentive for property owners to have more realistic expectations of value for small business. But any monies that were realized by that were actually going to go to a small business assistance fund, particularly for property owners that were dealing with some of the impacts of city-owned construction, whether it's the Van Ness BRT or the Central Subway. But in light of the pandemic, given everything that is happening, the Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to delay the implementation of Proposition D, the vacancy tax, until at least the beginning of next year.
And you mentioned the Central Subway. Is it delayed even more with the onset of the pandemic?
Yes, that is the gift that keeps on taking longer and costing more. And it has been delayed yet another 6 months, but it is getting closer to completion. And the good news for the struggling merchants in Chinatown, at the 4th Street station, at the Union Square station, is that virtually all of the above ground work is wrapping up, and everything else is going to be below ground. But I cannot tell you how frustrating it has been for me personally, and more importantly for my constituents that have been directly impacted. Actually, in the case of the Central Subway, it's the first time, one of the few agreements Ed Lee and I had, that the city has directly made mitigation payments to impacted small businesses.
Well, you and I have been talking about the Central Subway when you were in office and then out of office and back in office. And I've written a bit about the boring machines and all that. But why does the Central Subway stop at Union Square? Why, we had that whole situation with Washington Square Park. How did things end up the way that they ended up?
So that's a good question. The answer is originally, you may recall that it was actually designed to serve downtown along the Kearny Street corridor.
I forget to put the air ducts in there or something like that.
Say that again?
My understanding is they forgot to put air ducts in, so everyone would have suffocated.
There were all sorts of problems. Actually, the biggest problem was a very tight turn at Market Street that ultimately rendered the Kearny Street alignment infeasible. And there was a lot of pressure to actually have it serve Chinatown and link the southeast quarter of the city with the corner of the city that I represent. And ultimately, the Stockton Street alignment was chosen. The environmental documents, remember phase one that goes from the San Francisco border to the Caltrain station was paid for almost entirely with local funds. The second phase that goes to 4th Street, Union Square, and Chinatown almost exclusively with federal funds. And the plans that were submitted in those days, now over a decade ago, terminated at Chinatown, at Washington and Stockton. Ultimately, a decision was made to move the boring machines out 1,200 feet to the north, which really sets us up for a conversation about how ultimately we are going to connect the Central Subway with points to the north. That is a conversation that I actually appropriated some $1.3 million to start the planning to move it north. There are different configurations. It has been the subject of a lot of public meetings. I encourage people to remain involved with the SFMTA, whether it goes to Fisherman's Wharf. There are ideas about taking it to the west, to the marina. There are questions about above ground and below ground. And obviously, we will need a lot of federal largesse over the years to come in order to realize its full promise as it moves north.
Should we buy that land so we don't get held hostage by whomever owns it later, if the possibility of the Washington Square station comes up?
So that's a very good question. The city paid an inordinate amount of money, which I was highly opposed to not buy, but to temporarily use what was the old Palace Theater, that is now 9 condominiums. I felt for the price that the city paid, they should have absolute site control and should have bought that property. That opportunity has been foreclosed on now. But let me just say a little bit about federal and state law, which is you can't go and buy anything until you have done analysis and planning and environmental clearance. And we have not gotten to that stage yet. So buying something for the Central Subway at this point is not in the cards, but we should keep our options open.
Also, do I remember things incorrectly, or did we spend $70 million drilling those machines down to that spot under the auspices of saving the machines, which cost about $1 million a pop?
Your memory, Mr. Eskenazi, is very good. I was actually a proponent of doing what has been done many times in European subways, which was to bury those 2 boring machines in the earth and not extract them. We would have saved tens of millions of dollars.
At least we have those tunnels now, and as you mentioned, it does give us the possibilities in the future. You mentioned
go north, young man, go north.
You mentioned the condominiums here, and people before this forum reached out to me and asked me to poll you on your opinions of SB 902, which I guess is the son of SB 50, and is seen as a milder a piece of legislation. Is it something that you feel is a starter, or is this something that you can't foresee for San Francisco and for North Beach?
So let me start with what I think is most important around housing, particularly in the densest city on the western seaboard of the United States. And that is first and foremost preserving the most affordable housing that we have, which is our rent-controlled housing stock that is under tremendous pressure. And if you look at my record over 20 years, I've consistently worked for, introduced legislation for, buying many of those buildings, increasing anti-eviction protections, increasing rent control protections, minimizing pass-throughs of rent so that real people can continue to enjoy those to fight the forces of gentrification. While certainly the northeast corner of San Francisco, the district that I represent, which is the first settled district, the densest district, has less development opportunities than other parts of the city, which is why you see the most new housing development going into the South of Market area, heretofore largely a production, distribution, repair, warehouse part of the city that has changed remarkably in the last 10 years, into other parts of the city like the Bayview that had excess or unbuilt land. But in the northeast corner of the city, pretty much every time there has been, not pretty much every time, there has been vacant land, which started with the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, where the city was able to obtain parcels at Broadway and Battery, Broadway and Sansom, Broadway and the Embarcadero. I have pushed to turn those into affordable housing. So let me underscore the real name of the game here, if you want to have a diverse city that's worth living in, isn't market rate housing. It's really about using those opportunities for affordable housing. And to that end, when I actually got back in office after a 7-year hiatus, I pushed to undo the anemic inclusionary housing laws that Mayor Lee had enacted in the charter, our Constitution. And as a result of that, we are now in new construction building over 20% affordable housing. I think that is the name of the game. I'm not interested in $1,200 per square foot condominiums. The rich people can take care of themselves. It's real housing for real people for a diverse city that I'm interested in.
So SB 902 is not palatable for you?
So ultimately, anything that diminishes San Francisco's rubric, where we have been able to command much higher inclusionary housing percentages, more on-site affordable housing, that diminishes that, I think is bad public policy.
Speaking of diminishing, let's talk a little bit about the budget. And sorry to be so on the nose with these transitions. The budget, how do we even wrap our heads around the amount of money that we are going to have to forego in the next couple of years? What can we even begin to look toward not having and not doing?
Yeah, Joe, this is the biggest, most profound decision that is going to be before the 11 members of the board and the mayor. As you probably know, our fiscal year is a July 1, June 30 fiscal year. Because of the emergency, we have actually delayed the adoption of a new budget, and we'll be discussing it in the month of August. I don't think anybody, myself included, quite understands the magnitude of a $1.7 billion reduction in revenue for a city that has 53 departments, over 35,000 workers. It is going to be extremely tough. It's going to come with a lot of very hard, painful choices. It is likely to come with reductions in staffing and services precisely at the time when people are under the most pressure and need those services more than ever. And without telling tales out of school, I can tell you that our controller, who is universally respected, Ben Rosenfield, in all quarters, I have my Monday morning meeting with him, and a few weeks ago, as he was trying to describe the fact that this is not going to be a V-shaped recession where we're going to instantly bounce back, but it is going to be a long U-shaped trough recession where, as of now, over 141,000 San Franciscans have filed for unemployment, 20% of the workforce, and I'll admit that Ben shed a tear. Having said that, I went to this rodeo in 2008 during the Great Recession. We balanced our budget. We did it on time. We got through it. We laid off a lot of people. We shrunk city services. A lot of people suffered through that time. And as painful as it will be, I am prepared to discharge that duty again over the next 8 weeks.
Oh, you must mention Ben Rosenfield. When Ben starts to get nervous, it's like seeing the flight attendant begin to weep and put on the seatbelt. It means that you should be getting nervous too. It's very sobering. With that said, I guess there is some good news today that the state will not be clawing back the $180 million of ERAP funds at the exact wrong time, or at least it doesn't appear likely.
Well, that conversation has been delayed by a few weeks, and it is looking slightly more promising, but they could claw back a year of that funding. And the big imperative for the city and county and for the voters of San Francisco is actually to unlock a couple of $100 million that the voters overwhelmingly voted for, and that was Proposition C. Which was the measure that was put on actually not by the Board of Supervisors or the mayor, but put on by popular signature, which became the subject of a lawsuit by the Jarvis Gann folks and a handful of billionaires in San Francisco. And we are actually going to go before the voters this November with a way to unlock those monies, which are about $250 million that will be able to help solve not only our budget crisis, but address our homeless and behavioral health crisis as well.
And when it comes to budgetary issues, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk to you about the police department. What should be the future of the San Francisco Police Department? What does defunding the police mean to you? And what steps need to happen before anything like this becomes reality?
Well, as somebody I know said it very well, and actually former Mayor Brown said this in his column, which is this whole concept of defunding the police is some of the worst branding.
Oh, yeah.
That
even when George Lakoff tells you your branding sucks, it probably does, right?
Yeah.
But
terrible.
But insofar as reducing police responsibility and commensurate budget and giving that money to people who don't have badges and guns and qualified immunity, is this a good idea? And how much money are we talking about?
Right. And I think this is fundamentally about a societal rethinking of how we respond to crisis. Right now, if there's something that is happening that seems like an emergency, we call 911. And when we call 911, a police officer, and I got to tell you, the cops that I deal with every day at Central Station, that most of my constituents deal with every day, because Central Station covers almost all of District 3, except for a little sliver on the west side of Larkin Street that is in the Northern Police District. The working men and women of Central Station really are community policers. They know the names of shop owners. They know the names of habituates at cafes. And there's many stories of just how kind and loving and responsible and mature that they are. But they'd be the first to admit that they're not the right person to intervene with somebody who is in the midst of a mental health crisis that is exacerbated by somebody in blue with a badge and a gun coming along. Many of them will tell you that they would much rather have a mental health professional. That doesn't mean that they don't need to be there, but I think we have shown. As a matter of fact, when Gavin Newsom was mayor, we had a period of time where San Francisco reached a number of homicides that hit the magic 3-digit number of 100. And at that time, the board directed, allocated, appropriated tens of millions of dollars into violence prevention and youth jobs. And we saw that murder rate come down. There is an absolute role that the police have to play in our society. There are bad people out there, whether they're domestic violence, spousal abusers. There are people who do bad things. There are crimes that need to be solved. But there are actually other ways to use money that can help address ills in society. And when we talk about defunding the police, I think that's what people are trying to get to. We had a robust conversation about that at the Board of Supervisors this last Tuesday, the day before yesterday. And I will be having this conversation in July and August. And I think it is about early childhood education. It is about behavioral health services and an array of social services that are not just police, and I'm committed to that.
Well, your colleague, Supervisor Walton, would like to see $100 million off the police budget and redirected to many of the causes you mentioned, specifically within the Black community. Is that a realistic ask at this point in time?
So look, first of all, it's really not about coming up with a number. It's about coming up with systemic change. These are very complex operations. It's about how 911 is used. It is not just about coming up with a number. It is really about reimagining and rethinking what policing in San Francisco and urban America should look like. It's about crisis intervention. So I don't start with a number. I start with how are we going to reimagine and reoperationalize how we utilize the police in our society.
And it's now 6:16, so I'm going to go to some of the audience questions. And as a birthday gift for Rachel R., and I assume that this is the same Rachel R. that we all wished a happy birthday to at the onset, I will ask her question first.
And I do want to say to Rachel R., thank you for so much of what you are doing as really a hero, a frontline responder that has put literally your life on the line. So thank you for what you've been doing day in and day out, Rachel.
Well, Rachel asks, what is being done, or is there anything we could be doing in District 3 to contribute to the stock of hotels and safe sleeping spaces for our neighbors experiencing homelessness who need shelter in place and or isolation and quarantine spaces?
Yeah. So I was an early adopter of the concept of navigation centers, and I want to thank the Telegraph Hill dwellers and many of my constituents who were so cool when we wanted to have a temporary navigation site in what is now going to be a new affordable housing project at one of the former freeway parcels at Broadway and Front Street. And the community was so remarkably supportive of that. I spent 3 years finding a site. We ultimately found that site at 888 Post Street, which is being built out today for a navigation center. And I think there are many, many other opportunities in the northeast corner of the city. You may have seen a report that came out recently that the Board of Supervisors asked to be prepared that include port parcels along the Embarcadero that also include strategies that include organizations like North Beach Citizens, which is really one of the frontline homeless service providers in the northeast corner of San Francisco. So yes, Rachel, keep on advocating. Let's do more together.
Also here we have specific to District 3. What steps are being planned? What ideas are out there to help keep our local businesses up and running? You are speaking about the environment right now, so this has been on the screen for a little while. Does the pandemic provide an opportunity to get creative around sustainable growth, i.e. Green New Deal?
So, I mean, there's a million ways to answer that question, and I really, really want to thank my staff, Lee Hepner and the North Beach Business Association and the Telegraph Hill dwellers, who early on said that we should do everything in our power. And this always comes with a little bit of controversy, but if you go up the 13 and 1400 blocks of Grant Avenue, the 500 block of Green Street, over to Original Joe's at Union and Stockton, throughout the heart of the commercial corridors of North Beach, you will see that all of that parking has been turned into what I like to call streeteries or parklets. Today, in addition to over 100 barricades that we have borrowed, begged, and, well, we didn't steal any, but we definitely borrowed a few from different agencies, you will see that acres, literally acres of AstroTurf have been dropped along Grant Avenue to help bring them back. But I have to tell everybody the sad truth, which is some of these beloved institutions are not going to come back. They're not going to survive. And it's going to be an opportunity for new entrepreneurs to come, for the neighborhood to recreate itself, which North Beach has a proud tradition of. The same thing is happening on the Polk Street corridor. But yeah, and remember, buy local, shop local, whether it's to go and take out or outdoor dining, patronize your local establishments as much as you can.
And let me jump off the audience questions, because you reminded me of something that I really ought to ask. You said Grant Street, and of course Grant has been in the
Grant Avenue. I said
Avenue.
Grant Street and Grant Avenue. It was the first street, Joe, in San Francisco. It was DuPont Street. And I was born and raised on Herb Cain, and anybody who called it Grant Street was excoriated and ridiculed by Herb Cain. If I said Grant Street, that would be a huge faux pas. Grant Avenue, 100%, now and forever.
Well, Grant was toppled in Golden Gate Park, which was an interesting move. But less controversial was the removal of the Columbus sculpture, which you had a statement about. He's probably not coming back, but I guess what is going on there, and what needs to happen next?
I think we should all see this as a rare opportunity in human life to really think and be self-reflective as a society, and introspective and intentional about where we've been as a country and a city, and use this as a learning opportunity and as an occasion to heal old wounds and to listen to voices that have been speaking for a long time but have not been listened to. And that was the case relative to the early days statue, where a native person, Mariposa, actually came to our office and wanted that hurtful icon to be removed across from City Hall. And interestingly enough, a individual from Petaluma, California, fought that in an appeal through due process rights accorded to everybody, as they should be, to the Board of Appeals. And I came to the Board of Appeals and backed the Native community in its removal. I really want to salute my colleague, Catherine Stephanie, the only Italian-American member of the Board of Supervisors, who issued what I thought was a very beautiful and indeed courageous statement about what Columbus represents, and why not only the city could not guarantee the safety of that sculpture, but why, hurtful though it may be to some members of the Italian American community, why it was time to move that on. Now, that's very different than people toppling statues. Let's use this as an opportunity for a public discussion. And I am very committed to that, as is the Arts Commission and the Recreation and Parks Commission, the mayor, and all of my colleagues, as to what, if anything, will replace that statue in front of Coit Tower. And by the way, I have to say, I've gotten just fantastic oodles of email, all of which I have looped the Arts Commission into, and we are going to have a meaningful, open public process, whether it is on Zoom or in person after we find a vaccine, whether it's an Italian-American individual whether it's a native person or whether it's just flowers in front of Coit Tower.
But you have not been as receptive to renaming Columbus Avenue.
That's right. I mean, again, I think it's an opportunity for discussion and learning, but I think there's a very big difference between a place name and an iconic symbol, particularly because it comes with real impacts to real people's lives, whether it's having to deal with Social Security and the DMV, and that would impact thousands and thousands of people. I have generally, Joe, shied away from the politics of naming and renaming things, with a couple of exceptions. One, just in the last couple of years, was to remove the name of Justin Herman from what we now call the Embarcadero Plaza, where the Villancourt Fountain is, given Mr. Herman's history of African-American removal during the early days of redevelopment. And the other one was to name an alley that actually had no addresses on it, right off of Grant Avenue, that is now Jack Micheline Place. But generally, over the 20 years on and off that I've been involved in government, I've tried to use my time to do things that actually have a direct and meaningful impact on people's day-to-day lives. But this really is an opportunity for us all to understand our history and to understand how we have inculcated institutional racism in our society. And let's have that conversation. It's not going to be comfortable. It's going to be a lot of hard work, but it's easy to go topple a statue. It's a lot harder to really have a mature conversation about this and make things right going forward in our society.
I'll have a couple more from the here. Jim,
you're a little broken up.
Bars, restaurants tell me they don't feel safe at work. Some establishments seem less committed to safety than others. Will there be any effort to encourage establishments to maintain order?
So, Joe, I missed the first. You were a little broken up at the first part of that question. I got the. Will there be efforts to maintain order? But I missed the first part of that question.
It started out with Jim asking, North Beach neighbors who are working in bars and restaurants tell me they don't feel safe at work. Some establishments seem less committed to safety than others. Will there be an effort to encourage establishments to maintain order?
So I read the police reports literally every morning for the previous day, not only for the Central District, which is most of the district that I cover, but for the entire city. I see every single police report, as does my chief of staff, on a daily basis, and I respond to my police captain that I've read it and sometimes have questions. Weirdly enough, the number one increased crime during this pandemic has been arson, which has increased by 58% during the pandemic. Do not ask me why, when everybody's cooped up at home, there are a bunch of firebugs lighting stuff up, but that actually is the case. But relative to violence or lack of safety in restaurants and bars, I am not aware of any incidents, but if anybody would like to bring it to my attention, aaron.peskin@sfgov.org. I take safety very seriously. I will say this, violent crime has been down year over year in the city and county of San Francisco, and down even more during the pandemic.
Let's let you close it out. What do we need to know here? Where have we come together? What is going well, but what isn't going well? What do we need to do better as a city right now?
So I think the one thing that, in addition to dealing with the people who are suffering the most vulnerable people whose suffering has magnified under the pandemic, which I spoke to a little bit earlier, and I really am proud that we are delivering thousands of meals, that we are doing everything in our power to carefully and safely reopen the economy. And while we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back, the measures that the board our public health officials, as frustrating as it has been, and the mayor have really put San Francisco at the lead of reducing deaths and sickness and clogging up our ICU units at the hospital. And I really think we should all understand that took some political courage. But to answer your question, we continue to have a raging behavioral health crisis and homeless crisis on our streets. And we really, really have to address that in the months and years ahead.
And Trick, last question, who's getting indicted next?
If I had $1 for every rumor that I have heard, I would be rich, but I can guarantee you it's not me.
Fair enough. Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you to the Telegraph Hill dwellers for pulling this together.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Nick.
Very welcome. And yeah, listen, on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you guys. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Supervisor Peskin, for sharing your evening with us. I think we've all learned a hell of a lot. I always find listening to you guys, it's both illuminating, but also you are very engaging. And I hope you guys know that. Thank you also to everyone for attending. Our next event will be July 15th or 16th. We'll be hosting former Assembly member, Supervisor, and comedian. He's the trifecta, Tom Amiano, who'll be joining us along with Tim Redmond from 48 Hills. Yeah, he's got a new book out called Kiss My Gay Ass. So might give you a little bit of a hint. Mine just arrived in the mail. I'm excited to read it. And again, if you enjoyed this event, if you care about this neighborhood, you want to help make it a better place, please become a member today of THD. You don't even need to live here. It's $35 for an individual, $25 for a senior. We cannot take this neighborhood for granted. Our small businesses are facing challenging times. Our community is, and THD is on the forefront of these issues. So please go to thed.org, become a member. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Night. Missionlocal.org.
Thank you, Sarah.